Okay, Mr. Hidayat, could you stop your video, please?
Okay.
Okay. In the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful, welcome to the online program, online session today. This is our, I believe it's our third or fourth online session that we're offering this year to our audience, which includes our students as well as our faculty members and a number of people who are interested in this topic they're joining us from various parts of the world. Tonight, we are honored to have Professor Fisher, who is going to make his presentation about the history of the give and take between the Indian subcontinent and Britain over the past 400 or 500 years. Professor Fisher is Danforth Professor of History. He's an emeritus professor from Oberlin College, USA. He is an authority on the history of South Asia, the environmental history of the Indian subcontinent, and the history of the early travelers from the Indian subcontinent to Europe. He has published 12 books and 50 scholarly papers in his area of expertise. His most recent publications include Environmental History of India, A Short History of Mughal Empire, Visions of Mughal India, an anthology of European travel writing. Many of his books have been reissued due to the high demand for them in scholarly circles. Among such titles include Counterflows to Colonialism, Indian Travelers and Settlers in Britain, 1600 to 1857, which is, by the way, the topic of the talk tonight, the exact topic, the very topic. This is now a major source book on the early travelers from India. He has also published A Clash of Culture, Awadh, the British, and the Mughals. Since 1971, Professor Fisher has lived, researched, and taught for long periods in India with briefer trips to Pakistan and Bangladesh. He has been a visiting faculty fellow at the University of Delhi, University of Hyderabad, University of Allahabad, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. Professor Fisher has also served on the major committees of American Historical Association and the American Institute of Indian Studies. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor Fisher. You have 50 minutes to an hour for your presentation. It will be followed with half an hour of Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great honor to speak with you. I just want to make sure that this is shared. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right, very good. So the topic that I'd like to address is the tens of thousands of early Muslim visitors and settlers in Britain. I will be concentrating on those coming from the Indian subcontinent, which is, of course, today Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. And I'll be trying to get as much as possible from the perspective of the people who came, the men and women who came from South Asia to Britain over this long period of time. And as you all know, the perception of the host British, that is the natives of Britain, of these people was always very uncertain. Stereotypes developed, there were assumptions that were made that may not have been those shared by the visitors themselves. And so what I'd like to try to do is get at, as much as possible, looking at evidence such as this painting from 1765 about the Muslims who came. Now, their identification as to denomination, even as to names and background, are all very difficult to reconstruct, but I think we can make an effort in that direction. The place from which these people came was in about 1550, the middle of the 16th century, one of the richest in the world. Here we have a map of the globe where the size of the areas reflects their GDP as calculated by scholars at Sheffield and University of Michigan. And as you see, the Mughal Empire at this point was relatively much larger than Europe, only matched by China. And if we look at all of Europe, it's really dwarfed in the middle of the 16th century by the wealth of India and, of course, China. And as they calculated in GDP, and these are just very rough estimates, India was about 61 billion, whereas Europe was only 44 billion. So of the world's GDP, a quarter of it was in South Asia, was in India, and only about 18% in Europe. So really, it was relatively poor Europeans going to the riches of the East, and then people from the relatively rich East moving back toward Britain, or at least toward Europe. If we look at the context at the time, and this is really pre-colonial, there were two large spheres of mercantile commerce. There were dhows that moved from Iran, from Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and East Africa, back and forth across the western part of the Indian Ocean. These dhows were lateen rigged. They were originally developed out of dugout canoes, but of course became quite sophisticated sailing vessels. And from the east, from China and through Southeast Asia, there were Chinese junks that were actually developed from bamboo rafts, but became quite sophisticated. And as you all know, the Indian subcontinent, lying north of the equator, warms up over the spring and summer, creating a low pressure system as the hot air rises, and that creates the weather pattern known as the southwest monsoon that blows fairly steadily from June through September. This now enables dhows from the western part of the Indian Ocean and junks from the eastern part to come together and shift, meeting in India, shipping goods that then linked all of this into one economic unit. You can see the various products that are produced from each of these areas. And then as the Indian landmass cools down in the fall, the low is established over the ocean, which cools down more slowly. And of course, you get the northeast monsoon, and the vessels are able to go back in the other direction. So on an annual basis, you have a lot of transportation of goods throughout this area, which were really the envy of the world. Europeans also traded overland, but it was relatively smaller trade than the amount of trade in the Indian Ocean, because going by land, you can't transport as much goods. They have to be low volume, but high value goods. And when the Ottoman Empire develops, the Portuguese on the coasts of Europe decide that they want to get around this blockage and get back control over the trade with the rich East. And of course, they sent around ships that were not able to move around the Cape of Good Hope and reach India, particularly the port of Goa, but then other ports up and down the coast. And moving back and forth in Portuguese hands, they began to move goods back and forth. As the Safavid Empire developed, and then the Mughal Empire developed, it became ever harder for Europeans to try to control this overland trade. And as a result, joint stock corporations, particularly English East India Company, but also the Dutch and others, were stock corporations where merchants came together and incorporated themselves into an international corporation company and were able to move again around the southern part of Africa and into India. So we're talking about the movement of people in a novel way, in a different way that's ever been seen before in world history. You also find over the period from about 1757 onward, British military conquests and annexations of India. And if we just look at several phases of this area up here, Bengal and Bihar, is about 3 times the size of England, which the British took in one battle in 1757. By 1798, the British extended from Bengal into North India, from Bombay eastward through the Maratha lands, and from Madras westward and up the coast. And by 1841, and all the way up to 1857, about 2/3 of India was under direct British rule. About 1/3 was under India's princes, several hundred Indian princes. And then over the period from 1858 to 1947, of course, you have the British Raj, where all of this is brought under British Crown control. So that's really the context for the European assertions into India, into the subcontinent. And all of that is, of course, very well studied and very written about. But you're also talking about the movement of people in other directions. So what we find is from the Portuguese onward, people from South Asia, from the Indian Ocean, were moving to Europe on European ships, on Portuguese ships, as sailors, as servants, occasionally as travelers. And this occurred because when European ships went out to India, they often had very high death rates among their crews, and they needed Indian sailors to sail the ships back. So the European ships, European commanders, but often Indian sailors. There were also smaller numbers of Indians who went overland. This is, of course, well before the Suez Canal. So we're talking, what I suggest is a counterflow to European colonialism, not by any means as large, but nonetheless very much worthy of study. And in particular, there were counterflows to Britain, which I've concentrated on. From about 1600 onward, you have Indians appearing in Britain. And by over the next 250 years, there are about 40,000 Indians who come mostly as sailors, but servants, workers, wives, elites, diplomats, and so on. And we'll be looking at those as much as possible. In this work, I really complement the work that's been done by some of your faculty members. A couple of parts of this Shias in Britain have come out, and there's one more very much anticipated, looked forward to. So I'm trying to complement their work. Now, there were many classes of different Muslims who went to Britain. There were sailors, seamen, they were called lascars or kalasi. There were workers of servants of all sorts, and then there are elites. And these are very, very broad categories, but they do give you a sense of the people who came. We'll start by looking at the sailors, the seamen. Many of them were very skilled from their long experience in the Indian Ocean, and they were really skilled workmen. Often they were paid more than European sailors on the vessels, in part because there was such demand for them, and in part because they were so valued as sailors. And from fairly early on, we see fragmentary evidence about these people. So for example, according to East India Company records, in 1607, there were 5 Indians. Now, by Indians, they can mean people from Southeast Asia, from India, what's today Bangladesh or Pakistan. It's not clear exactly whom they meant, but they were living in London, and they petitioned the early East India Company for employment, and they were complaining against the working conditions that they were working under. So from early on, we find working class Indians in London who are trying to stand up for themselves, and we see fragments of their interests, of their identities in this kind of evidence. 7 years later, there were 3 so-called Indian sailors. And again, we're not sure who they were. there's a high probability that they were Muslims because many fewer Hindus left India. Elites didn't go because there was a belief that if you crossed the Black Waters, the Kalapani, you would lose status. So most of the people who came and were classed as Indian were probably Muslims. They were living in London. They married English wives, and very large numbers of Indian male immigrants who came in married English or Irish or Scottish wives. And they asked the East India Company that was employing them to go back to India on one of its first voyages by the East India Company to India to take their English wives with them. The English East India Company directors decided that having 3 women aboard this cramped ship for what could be a year and a half long voyage back and forth would really be improper. So what they did is they agreed to take some of the wages given to these Indian sailors and give them to their English wives living in London. So from early on, we find a sort of a different attitude toward Indians that we might expect looking back from the 20th or 21st centuries. Now, if we use the records found in ship's logs, for example, or in accounts by the British, the English East India Company tried to keep a record at various times of the numbers of sailors who came in, recording their names. Often these were not their real names, but names assigned to them by the British. We can see the gradual progress. So these records begin in 1740, and just this record series ends in 1762. But in that amount of time, you can see documented about 1,400 Indian sailors going from Britain back to India. Now, because some died in Britain or decided not to go home, this number only shows those who decided to go back, not the total number that were arriving or that were living in Britain. You also begin to see fragments of Indians. This is the new East India House that was built by the East India Company. And soon thereafter, there were paintings of it with its classical architectural structure. But if you look closely down here, I would suggest this is probably someone from India, quite likely a sailor or perhaps a merchant who's coming, maybe asking directions. But the fact that he would be put into this picture as almost an incidental image, suggests how common it was to have Indians on the streets of London. And again, there are probably Indians over here who are also associating themselves with the East India Company, petitioning, going to visit, going to meet each other, so that we can begin to see part of the Indian or the South Asian community in London from fairly early on, from the middle of the 18th century on. Now, again, these people were classed as Indians, but we know from the fragmentary records that we find that they were really from all over the Indian Ocean. It was very rare, but in 1818, the ship Hercules that had sailed from Calcutta to London.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Fisher, Professor Fisher. Is it possible that you would show the image a bit bigger than what you are showing at the moment?
Well, it's taking up the entire screen. Is it not showing on yours as this time?
Well, others can, maybe others can tell me. What I can see is only a small image at the top of my screen.
Yes, it's a large image.
Sorry, no. On my screen, it is fine, and I should really thank Professor Fisher for his excellent presentation. I'm really enjoying my time. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry. Just ignore my comment, please.
No, please. It's probably one of these Zoom settings somehow. But I will continue since most people seem to be able to see it. So what I was able to calculate from this unusual account from 1818 was where the sarangs, that is the foreman of the headman of the Lascar crew, came from. The Tyndalls were his assistants, and those are red diamonds. and then the Lascars, the seamen themselves, and then there were a few servants who were working for the sarong as his cook or his valet and so on. And if you look at where they came from, many come from the Arabian Peninsula. One claimed to come from Mecca, some from Iran, some from what's today Pakistan, Southeast Asia, what's today Indonesia, Malaysia, all up and down the coast of India. The largest number came from Bengal, but there were some from Burma as well. So all of these people were classed as Indians, although as you can see, they are not really Indians as we would think of them today. And that's always something to keep in mind. The largest number coming from India, but it was a very diverse group of people. We also don't know, except occasionally when their names are included, whether they're Muslims or within that, of course, it's always very, very, very difficult to know the denomination as Shia or Sunni, because this was not something the British were really very aware of. When we accumulate these records, going, as I did for years, going through East India Company records, we can get a sense of the number who came. So in the early part of the 19th century, almost 1,000, over 900 arrived per year. Now, numbers of these made multiple trips, so that this is not unique numbers. People decided to arrive take multiple trips, which suggests that they felt the trip was worth it. And by the 1820s, after the Napoleonic Wars, there were many more British seamen around, so there was less need for Indian sailors, and so the numbers who arrived each year went down somewhat, but still 500 a year. And if you're talking about many years, this number increases. And then again, it rises up. So by the 1850s, between 3,000 and 3,600 sailors were arriving annually in Britain, mostly in London. And you can see how this might have a major effect on the sort of the life of London, particularly in certain parts of London. If we take a map of today's London, with of course Islamic College out here, the wharfs where the ships arrived coming up the Thames were all here. Canary Wharf is now, of course, a major business center. It used to be called the Isle of Dogs, but they upgraded that because it wasn't so attractive to international companies. But this is where the ports, where the docks were for the ships arriving internationally into London. And therefore, this is the area where you find the largest numbers of Indian sailors arriving and staying, and the largest number of Indian servants arriving and then dispersing through London, in fact, through all of Britain. If we look at a map from the period, we can see there was the St. Catherine's Dock, which was at that point the largest dock. And what you found was substantial numbers of Indians arriving, and the East India Company was legally responsible, held responsible financially by Parliament, for taking care of all of these sailors while they were in Britain, giving them shelter, food if they wanted, and then giving them free trips home, because according to the Navigation Acts from the 1660s onward, the ships were coming in could have Indian, non-British sailors, but the ships that were going out had to have only British crews. So if you have 300, 400, 500 Indian sailors arriving in Britain, they're paid off by their British ship captains. They can't get a job going home, but they get a free passage home and free room and board while they're in London, as long as they want to stay from the East India Company. You can understand that a number of them stayed on. And the East India Company, between 1797 and 1802, to accommodate these people, made contracts with a number of rooming house keepers in the Shoreditch area. These were individual sort of like Airbnb type places where there would be long-term contracts, and hundreds of Indian sailors concentrated here. They would get off the ships would go into the dock, and then they would be transported across London and given room and board in this Shoreditch area. Now, because it was some distance from the docks, the British then, after 1802, or actually from 1799 onward, began to offer contracts to people to rooming house keepers and then to dormitory keepers in Shadwell, which is much closer to the docks. And here in Shadwell, there were custom-built, purpose-built dormitories in which hundreds of Indian and other Asian sailors would be allowed to stay. They would be given food, clothing, and significantly within the compound of these dormitories, the British largely left them alone. So you have the proprietor who has a contract from the East India Company. It's paid so much per sailor per day for room and board. But within the area, he largely stayed out of their lives. And you find in very rare accounts, but occasionally, that the sailors tended to continue to keep their shipboard crew pattern. So a ship that arrived, all the sailors would get off and they would eat together, sleep in the same area of the dormitory. The next ship would be nearby. There was clearly some cross-cutting so that Muslim sailors, for example, from India, from Bengal, might also get together and form messes where they would cook together and share sort of a living space, or from Malaysia. Now this comes up because occasionally, if you have sailors ashore for 3 or 4 months, room and board paid for, nothing to do, there were occasionally affrays or battles with the British, sometimes called riots. And if you look at the lists of the people accused on each side, it's clear that there was some sorting out by religious denomination, as well as sorting out by crew. So you would side with your crew against another ship's crew unless you shared a religious denomination, and then it was not clear which side that you would be on. So there was a very rich life that was largely self-controlled by these Lascars in Shadwell. After the East India docks opened up in 1806, there was a gradual movement that we'll be looking at as Indian sailors began to be housed closer to the East India docks. But in the year before these docks opened, the East India docks opened in 1806, there was a very interesting festival that I think it's worth looking at in detail. Between the 1st and the 10th of April, 1805, which you probably know are the first 10 days of Muharram 1220 in that particular year, a British reporter in the annual register, and then it was republished in the Chronicle, had a fairly extensive account about something he didn't quite understand, but he documented fairly well. That is, over a period of days, Lascars, and it wasn't probably only Lascars, other people from South Asia living in London would also came in, had what he called, the English reporter called, a Mohammedan people of the Muhammad persuasion in East End, that is in the area of Shadwell, had a grand religious festival. Now you're probably already aware, which the reporter was not, what's going to happen in the first 10 days of Muharram? Well, you're going to have a procession. Here we have one from 1880, so somewhat later, by an early Indian photographer named Din Dayal, of a procession in Bhopal. And as you all know, these are in South Asia very common. These are taziyas, replicas of the tomb of Imam Hussein bin Ali, which are carried through the streets of cities, and Shiites, particularly Shiite Muslims particularly, take over. They're not the only ones to participate, but it's largely their commemoration of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein at the Battle of Karbala. And for 10 days, the streets are taken over by Shiites. So what we find in London in the first 10 days, early April, is they went on a slow procession along New Roads, St. George's and East, Cannon Street, Radcliffe Highway, Shadwell, and other streets with drums and tambourines. And if we look at a map of this particular area, this is a map from this time, we find this is where the depot was, the major depot, where they were housed. And they went in a procession. We'll blow this up, not exploded, but we'll make it bigger so you can see. If you look at this more closely, this is where the Lascars were largely housed. That was their dormitory, their compound. And they moved up a long new road, down Cannon Street, around Ratcliffe Highway. So what they're clearly doing is going over and in many ways taking over the streets of their neighborhood, in which certainly other people can participate, but they are the dominant group. And interestingly enough, this is St. George, which was an Anglican church right in the middle of it. Many of the Muslims who died were buried in St. George churchyard. They were allowed to be. So this is really the East End, or what the British called the Oriental Quarter, was an area which at least once annually, Lascars took over the streets and really controlled things. If we go on with this newspaper report, it talks about them. Part of them were selected with great dances, with drawn swords, cutting the air in various directions, with 4 blacks, that is, Asians, long white robes, with emblematic figures in their hands. Another with a vase in which there's a fire, and a man in a white vestment treading backwards put incense into it. Another with a handkerchief fanning their faces. At every turn of the streets, a group of the same people lifted up their hands and heads to the canopy of heaven, hymning some passage out of the Quran. Now, clearly, the English newspaper man didn't understand Urdu or Persian or Arabic. So he's reading a lot into this. But I think we can unpack it and begin to see the kinds of things that might. Session, again by Dean Dayal, the 1880s. This is in Hyderabad. And you get a sense of how the streets of Hyderabad, Deccan, were taken over, again, by Shiites in the streets with drawn swords, in many ways replicating in Hyderabad what had been done by their compatriots in London in 1805. And then the report concludes they conducted them with great propriety. So there wasn't any apparent animosity or hostility or fear among the British about this. Although a multitude of people, including sailors, servants, maybe some Indian diplomats who were in London at the time, and maybe common English people who were looking at this great festival, followed them. Now, the reporter tries to reconstruct probably what he was told about the reasons for this. We understand it was kind of a jubilee in honor of the commencement of the new year. And in fact, Muharram is the first month of the Islamic year. So he's got that probably right. And the translation of Muhammad into paradise. Now, this might be the movement of Muhammad up to paradise on Barak, but it wasn't done in Muharram. So he probably got that not quite right. Imploring him, that is the Prophet Muhammad, to give peace to the suffering world and a safe passage to their home country. So again, it's distorted, but we get a sense of the kinds of things that we might be able to reconstruct from this kind of evidence. And as I suggested, after the East India docks opened up in 1806, and here they are, and a larger picture of it. This is where the ships went in. This is where the export goods were loaded, the import goods were loaded, and then on into India. And these areas, Limehouse and Poplar, became the East End, became the Oriental Quarter from about 1835 all the way to the middle of the 20th century, when other immigrant groups began to take over. Now in London, this was the major center, but there were also Lascars Indian seamen aboard ships that went ashore in Bristol, in Liverpool, in Hull, in Glasgow. And so they were pictured almost randomly by British people in those places. This is from 1840. John Dempsey was an artist who did these silhouettes. And so he would do a silhouette and then very quickly do an image. And all of the pictures, including of Europeans, had these black faces. So we have to assume he wasn't just blacking out their faces. This was just his style. But we can get from the kind of clothing they wore, maybe carrying petitions or request for work or passage home. And this was in Bristol, but in other parts of the British Empire, there were small pockets of Indians as well. Now, some of the Indians did very well financially. Others struggled to stay on in Britain. So here we have a German artist, Karl Hartmann, in around 1847, doing a picture of a, quote, Indian crossing sweeper. This was Berkeley Street in London. And he did this sketch of the man. If you look at the history, after the Napoleonic Wars, particularly after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a lot of British wounded sailors or retired sailors and seamen took up work as crossing sweepers, remembering in the 1840s that most of the carriage in Britain was by horse-drawn vehicle, and the streets would be filled with dung. So there were people who would stand on the corners with brooms and for a tip, sweep aside a clear passage for men in their spats and shiny shoes and women in their hoop skirts so that they wouldn't get soiled. And this was lower middle class kind of work. You could get a lot of money if you got a good crossing. Some crossings were not so popular and they didn't get as much. And as the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, the British veterans of the Napoleonic Wars died out, Indian Lascars took over this and divided up the crossings among themselves. And so it became very expected in the 1840s and 50s that keeping the path for you would be an Indian. Some of these were able to save up enough money to start lodging houses of their own in the Indian quarter, where they would
Sorry, Doctor, we lost you for a moment. Are you back on?
Yes, I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
My internet connection is stable, so if I lose it, please let me know. So some of them did quite well as lodging house keepers. Many had to struggle. If we move on from seamen to workers, this is the next largest group. And unlike the seamen, who were all men, many of the workers were women. So this is a class of people, servants, workers of all sorts, who came to Britain, usually working for British people, but sometimes for Indian elites as well. And from very early, if we go back in time, you can begin to see images of these people. So here we have from 1633, the very famous Dutch-English painter, Antony van Dyck, painted an Indian. Now, he charged a lot of money. So whoever paid for this was willing to pay a lot of money to this famous artist to have an Indian. It was painted from life in London. But the Indian's name is not given, nor is his identity really known. We can know a little bit of his backstory, and I'll give that in a moment. But perhaps you can look at his turban, his robes, silk robes, it looks like, his face, and try to guess or suppose who he might have been, where he might have come from. If we look at the entire picture, it was paid for by the Earl of Denbigh, who is here and clearly the center. The Earl of Denbigh was the master of the wardrobe of King Charles I. He went first to Iran and then to India as the ambassador in 1633. And when he returned, he brought back at least one Indian servant with him. Now, the family story of Denbigh was that while he was in India in a jungle hunting, here's his rifle, he got lost. And an Indian who was a passerby directed him as to how to escape from the forest. And as a reward, the Earl offered to take the Indian on a pleasure trip back to London. And the Indian remained there for about 2 years. he had this portrait painted of him with the Indian included, suggesting a respect as well as clear subordinate status, but it's the Indian who really knows what's going on, and Denby who's lost. So to really talk about this, this is an Occidental man in the Orient who becomes disoriented, and an Oriental man reorients him and then goes back with him to the Occident before returning 2 years later to the Orient. So we have images like this which suggest the complex roles that such Indians had. Another Indian, this is by another famous artist from 1674. Again, we don't know his name. It was not mainly about him, but he's included. He's not wearing probably Indian dress as far as we can tell, but he identifies an Indian. And again, we can estimate, given his visage, who he might have been. In this case, Lady Charlotte Fitzroy was an illegitimate daughter of King Charles II, Countess of Lichfield. He was given an Indian servant, perhaps slave, perhaps servant, to attend her. Now, he's certainly attending on her, he's providing her with food. There's no suggestion of any sort of a sexual threat from him. He's honored by being in the picture, but he's clearly in a subordinate status. So this is really another indication of the great wealth of this English household, that they would be able to afford Indian servants. It cost a lot to bring them, to house them, and then to send them back. So they're by no means inexpensive labor. They were expensive but prestigious labor. Another example is from a brother of Robert Clive, who came back to India with his household, which included a number of Indian servants. And then he had Joshua Reynolds, again, a famous painter in 1706, paint his household. His daughter, wearing Indian clothes, or pseudo-Indian clothes, is center. Clive and his wife are framing, but in the middle of the picture, but looking down, is their honored Indian servant who came back with them from India. Now, we know from the ship's record that they called her Bola. We don't really...
Sorry, could you repeat your voice is muffled. Could you repeat your statement?
Oh, yes, okay. So she came back with Clive, and if you look at her, she is wearing probably gold ornaments, perhaps dyed ivory ornaments, Indian style perhaps, but wealthy clothes. And perhaps those of you who know Indian jewelry better than I, whether this is a tali that she's married, it's not clear whether these were things that she owned or whether they were given to her for the sake of the picture. But nonetheless, here she is. Again, some evidence about her. She went back to Britain after about 2 years there, carrying with her, as all the Indians who went back, stories. She didn't write it down, but she would convey to her friends and to her successors what it was to live in Britain. Now, other people who came as workers were skilled animal trainers, and I'd like to look at one of them. Mir Jafar, who was the Nawab of Bengal, sent back a caracal, a black ear. This creature comes from Central Asia. It's very delicate. It's very difficult to train and to manage. But Mir Jafar sent as a present to King George Abdullah from Murshidabad as the keeper of this animal. He arrived in 1759. He spent about 1.5 years in London. And when he arrived, he was really celebrated. So here we have a larger picture of him. The king took the creature and gave it to the London Tower, which at that point was a zoo, a menagerie, and had the prime minister arrange for Abdullah, and that's all we know about his name, to be taken around the highlights of life in London, to be paid a stipend, to be put up very well, to be guided by the royal keeper of beasts of the tower, and then sent home with a very lavish present, going first class back by ship to Bengal, where the prime minister wrote to the governor of Bengal, Clive, saying that we very much value him and we want to have a complete account of his passage, his diet, what he was fed, how he was handled, how well he was treated aboard ship, as to he was, quote, whether used well on the voyage or otherwise. So here we have a man who went to Britain as a skilled worker. It's not easy to handle a caracal, and he was treated very well there. Abdullah, in fact, ended up making 3 trips to Britain. This was his first. He came back, another one a couple of years later, with another gift of one of these felines. And then we find him coming for probably his last trip in 1764. So here's Abdullah again. It's the same man, this time with a cheetah, and he had an assistant who helped take care of it. This was a gift from the retiring governor of Madras, Sir George Pigott, who came back with 6 Indian servants, the cheetah that he presented in King George III. And King George said, all right, show me what it can do. So Abdullah and his assistant took the cheetah to Windsor Great Park on 30 June 1764 and had Abdullah set the cheetah against an English stag to see who would win. Now the stag was able to drive off the cheetah, but the cheetah then broke away and killed a fallow deer. And there were extensive newspapers account about this, ending while the cheetah was devouring its prey, the Indian attendants caught it, covered its head with a hood, put on its color, and secured it. So Abdullah then is, if you will, celebrated as this expert. There's another instance in which Abdullah shows up. He was going back from Windsor Great Park. He stopped overnight in Kew Garden, living on Rosemary Lane, and he stayed in a boarding house. And in the middle of the night, he and a fellow Muslim student, a servant, were robbed by the tavern keepers, the Ryan family, who forcibly broke into their room, stole, and then this is a list of what they stole: his silver shoe buckles, value 10 shillings, a pair of cotton stockings, value 1 shilling, a silk purse, value 2 pence, 1 linen purse, valued 1 pence, 1 piece of silver coin called a rupee, value 2 shillings, 2 pieces of coin known as a fanum, which is a South Indian coin, value 1 penny, 5 guineas, and 14 shillings British money. Now, before the courts, the Ryans were arrested on Abdullah's word. They were put on trial. They were found guilty by the British judge and forced to return all of his valued goods. And then the Ryans were sentenced, perhaps even by deportation to Australia. So the courts took the word of the Indian over his Irish innkeepers. Abdullah then went back, but what's also interesting is while he came on this third, British had trouble with Abdullah, so he became known as John Morgan. It's the same man, but many of the Indians either were forced or willing to take the names, English names, in order to sort of fit into British society. So we again have evidence that we can reconstruct about the life of this Muslim. Another man who came, actually he was leading a delegation of 3 people, came in 1834. This is a man named Khwaja Bakhsh. He was a cavalry officer who had been working for the British and was fired for complaining to the British authorities that the British officers in his command of his cavalry regiment had embezzled money. He couldn't get satisfaction in India, so he and 3 of his companions took a 17-month-long trip via Egypt to go to London to complain. He sent in petitions to the Court of Directors. The Court of Directors put him up in first-class quarters in the Oriental Quarter. They gave him allowance. They held hearings into this case, and they had British officials testify, and some British officials, particularly the ones accused by Khwaja Bakhsh of embezzlement, said that he was wrong, but there were other British officials who said that he was absolutely right. The British had embezzled the money. So the British authorities decided to send him back, Khwaja Bakhsh, back to India, and to give him allowance on the way, and to directed the English government in India to investigate the case. Now, while Khwaja Bakhsh and his companions were sitting around waiting for justice, which they eventually partially got, a famous British painter, Sir David Wilkie, was commissioned by the widow of an English general, David Baird, who had been the victor over Tipu Sultan at the battle in Seringapatam in 1799. And the widow commissioned this British painter to paint a great scene of the British general, her late husband's victory. Wilkie had never been to India. He knew nothing about it. He was able to buy some of the robes that had been captured from Tipu Sultan's palace, some of the weapons and the sheep, but he didn't really know what Indians looked like. So he went to East India Company House and he hired Indians. He didn't really know, he couldn't talk to them, but he posed them for the picture because he wanted to portray them. Now, Khwaja Bakhsh was here pictured as Tipu Sultan dying. And as soon as Khwaja Bakhsh realized that he was being pictured as Tipu Sultan, he got up and objected because he had been part of the army that defeated Tipu Sultan. So Wilkie then posed him as an Indian sepoy, Indian soldier, defeating Tipu Sultan's army, and then Khwaja Bakhsh was very happy. But one day Khwaja Bakhsh and several of these other models disappeared. Wilkie didn't know why. It was that Khwaja Bakhsh has gotten some justice from the British and just had gone home. So Wilkie, and here's the whole picture, finishes the picture, and here's Baird triumphing. It's clearly centered on Baird, but nonetheless, there are Indians around. Other Indian sailors or servants and ayahs or Indian women to pose for this picture. So we don't know much about them. And some of these people complained about how cold Wilkie's studio was, wearing thin Indian garments. But there are these snatches of Indians there. Very quickly, because I know I'm running low on time, let's look quickly at some of the elites who came. And in order to focus this, what I like to do is focus on the princely state of Oudh. It was an independent state from about 1722 onward. It was ruled by a Shiite dynasty, one of the most prominent Shiite dynasties in India, and it became one of the first allies of the British. Although they allied with the British, in 1801, the British took half the territory away in order to link British territories. And a number of rulers of Oudh sent delegations, high-powered delegations, to London to try to get justice against this annexation. Some of the to the royal throne also came to London. So, for example, one of the several missions that came was from Nawab Iqbal-ud-Dawla. He was a cousin of the ruler, at this point, the Padshah of Oudh, who claimed the throne. He went to London. He had been pensioned off, living in Benares in exile, but he came to London in order to try to convince the the British government of India to displace the ruler, his cousin Nasiruddin Hyder, and replace him by Iqbal-ud-Dawla. And if you look at his clothing, he's clearly wearing some Indian garments and also some British garments. These paintings were by an anonymous woman, H.J. is how she signed herself, who used to, she was really became infatuated by this delegation, and she would hide out looking around the corner and sketch them. So she didn't talk to them. She didn't really know who they were, but she sketched them. So Iqbal Abdallah came, he claimed to be the heir of the throne, although she has him as the king. That was what he wanted to be. And he also came with a suite. And if we look at the suite of people who came, there was a secretary, a munshi, who came as his clerk. There was his younger brother who came along. There were a cook. There were what she called a Brahmin, but clearly is a Maulvi, so she didn't quite get that right. And there were various attendants. And so there were about 30, mostly Shiites, in this delegation living in London for a couple of years. They hired some British people to be their PR man, and they were able to get the support of the opposition party to the government, including the future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli tried to influence people on their behalf, tried to use them for his own political purposes. And the British government of India living in Britain wrote to the Governor General saying, I wish that you would not permitted Iqbal O'Dowd to leave India. If these Bahadurs come to England, they'll give infinite trouble and throw no small suspicion on the wisdom and justice of our Indian government. In the meantime, I refuse to present the Oudh Prince to the British king or to take any notice of him. And all the members of the British cabinet have been, like me, refusing to answer his calls or correspond with him, except for Lord Holland, who mistakenly thought that Iqbal O'Dowd was the Turkish ambassador and did a return visit. So they didn't really know even who he was. Eventually, Iqbal O'Dowd didn't get the throne of Oudh, but he was working out an agreement where he was agreed to retire from London and go to Baghdad. He was given a knighthood, so he became Sir Iqbal O'Dowd, and he was given a pension by the British to get him out of town. So that these delegations, and there were about 30 of these delegations, were often very influential in Britain. After 1801's annexation, the British really pushed the pressure on the rulers of Oudh, and a number of delegations came. Then in 1856, the British took over all of Oudh. They exiled the last ruler of Oudh, Wajid Ali Shah. They put him into exile down in Calcutta. They offered him a 150,000 pound pension, making him one of the richest noblemen in England. But the Oudh ruler, Wajid Ali Shah, turned it down rather than accept this annexation. He wanted to go to London himself and petition Queen Victoria, but instead, since the British wouldn't leave him, he sent a delegation that included a munshi, a high court official, his own brother, his heir apparent, son and heir apparent, a high-ranking aide, and an agent or vakil who had a lot of experience working for the British. These were they were all Shiites. There were about 113 people in the delegation. And when they arrived in Britain, they were really lavishly received. The English aristocracy wanted to invite them all to dinner. The newspapers had accounts about them. They rented the house of the Duke of Brunswick on Harley House in London. And for a time, they were really the lions of British society. The Queen Mother, that is Wajid Ali Shah's own mother, came along, but of course she was not pictured. And many of the British newspapers' accounts celebrate her in seclusion. When English noblewomen went and visited her, they asked for direct accounts of what she wore, what she was like. So the fact that she was in Purdah, as were her high-ranking attendants, made her ever more fascinating for British society. So they were actually doing very well. They published books on their behalf. They got a lobbying going. But what happens in 1857 is the so-called mutiny or the War for Independence breaks out in Britain. And by October 1857, the word reached Britain about this uprising centered in Oudh, the home territory of these people. And instead of being celebrated, lionized, they became known as one of the Indian mutineers. So suddenly, from being high ranked in society, they became really villains, almost subhuman villains. They lost their source of income because they were cut off from India. There were lawsuits by some members of the delegation against others. Many of the servants weren't paid. There was a lot of internecine conflict within the delegation. Some of the servants and some of the high delegates married English women and sort of separated off from the rest of the delegation. Some wanted to go back, some wanted to stay on. And finally, the bulk of the people decided to go home via Paris. And in Paris, the Queen Mother died. And so in the newspaper reports about her funeral, there's the death of the Queen, the unusual ceremonies that gave rise to this. So some of the opprobrium left after they left London. She was of ill house before she left London. However, the recent mutiny in India caused greater disease. And so, although she refused to submit to British doctors, she tried to go home. She died in Paris. And so in the British newspapers, they have the delegation sadly holding a vigil where her corpse is behind the screen. There is probably an imagined picture of her tomb or of her coffin with her attendants. There is the burial in a cemetery in Paris, and you can go there and her gravestone is still there. And so what we find is after 1857, really the whole role of Indians shifted. And we can talk about that in a number of ways, but many of the experiences that Muslims have in London in the 21st century reflects the post-1857 attitudes. So what we've seen is a number of different people coming of different classes, having different experiences, men and women who all experienced London in different ways. A few wrote about it, and your faculty have written about some of those people, but many we can only see through fragments, guessing, estimating what their lives must have been like during their time in Britain. Okay, I was asked to stop at this point, so perhaps we can have some questions, some discussion. I look forward to that.
Thank you very much, Professor Fisher, for a fascinating, enlightening, and delightful lecture. Usually I give a 5-minute or 10-minute advance notice to lecturers, but I was so enthralled that I didn't give it to you and you stuck by your time. Thank you. We're going to allow one question which would be spoken and another question from the chat section. Starting with Professor Paya, please go ahead, make it to the point and succinct. Thank you very much.
I should say hello to Professor Fisher.
Yes,
it was a great pleasure. Yeah, it was a great pleasure listening to your brilliant talk. I'm sure all of us who were participating in this talk were enjoying our service. Myself must confess that I really enjoyed your talk. I wish I had asked you earlier to share your wisdom with us in order to make those papers which I myself and Dr. Jahangir have produced much more informative. Now, the chair, the moderator has asked us to just ask one question, but I would want to cheat and ask you 2 questions, if you allow me.
Yes, of course, I'll be honored.
Thank you so much.
So far there's no other question. You're free to ask a question.
My first question is, you mentioned about the elites. And as you know, and I must say that we have learned quite a lot from your brilliant books and papers. I must acknowledge my intellectual debt to you. It's great to learn from a great scholar. Now, one of the elites who came to London and went back was Mirza Hossein Esfahani. What I'm mentioning him just as one example. My question is, what was the role of the elite in transferring modern ideas about, if you like, modern science to India and from there to other parts of Muslim land? So the role of the elite in transference of scientific ideas to Muslim lands, especially in India. And my second question is about the role of the college, which the East India Company built, erected or established here in London, in the UK, in order to train the civil servants who were supposed to go to India. Could you please also, if you feel free to tell us something about these two topics, the college, Haileybury College, and the role of the elite in transference of the knowledge. Thank you so much.
Certainly, and of course, you're being excessively generous in your comments. In terms of science, the British clearly were developing certain kinds of sciences, which many of the Indians who wrote about life in Britain highlighted. These tended to be some of the technical sciences, for example, medicine. India had a very developed set of medical practices going all the way back. But there were certain aspects of it which they decided not to develop. For example, surgery. So you have humoral kinds of medicine, Ayurvedic kinds of medicine, later Unani kinds of medicine. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but Indians decided that to actually do anatomy and surgery, where you're involved with a lot of messy substances, it was not a nice thing to do, was not a highly developed science. So really from the 1830s onwards, you begin to get Indians, young Indian students, who I guess you would class as elites, coming to London, often on scholarships, on fellowships, and studying British medical practices around anatomy and surgery and so on. And then going back, particularly to Calcutta, but spreading out from there. And so the Calcutta Medical College was established in the middle of the 19th century. Many of the first Indian doctors, surgeons were trained in Britain. So one of the things that they brought back were medical kinds of sciences. Elites were also interested in technical things like cannons, warfare. Many of the elites who came had a military background. And so the kinds of weapons that the British were particularly good at, both mass-produced weapons, rifles, cannons, things like this were very much impressive. Another skill that was developed in Britain, a set of skills, was around steam. The British developed through the Industrial Revolution, the end of the 18th century onward, steam power, and steam became the wave of the future. So steam-driven engines, steam-powered stamps for printing presses, for coining. These were all things that the British really had excelled at. They had the coal, they had the iron ore, and India really didn't develop it until much later. So some of the early delegations from the 1830s were shipbuilders who developed in Bombay in particular, and many of these were Parsi rather than Muslim. Shipbuilders had developed very good techniques for shipbuilding using Indian teak, which of course was very, very prestigious, was very good. Many of the teak forests were cut down to supply ships for the British Navy and the British civil maritime services. but the Indians did not really have the technology to put steam engines in these ocean-going vessels. So a series of Indian elites came to Britain and interned with leading British shipyards and learned how to really use British boilers. They couldn't make boilers of their own, but import boilers and put them into steamships. So these are just two of the kinds of sciences, one based around steam and the other based around medicine, that were particularly imported by India. Printing presses, for example, often using steam, but even hand ones were not really developed very well in India until British presses came in. As far as the colleges, there are a number, as you rightly point out, and as you know very well for your own work. Haileybury College was established for British civil servants going to India. They had Indian teachers there teaching Persian and Hindustani or Urdu. They had a Persian faculty member teaching Persian. There's Addiscombe College in Croydon, south of London, where the East India Company soldiers, cadets were also trained with some Indian teachers who lived, many of them married English women and stayed on. And then of course there's University College London, which was very early in offering training in Indian languages, not so much for British civil servants or military, as much as for merchants, British merchants who wanted to go to India and had some need for Indian languages. So for example, Dadabhai Naorojdi, who was the second Indian elected to the British Parliament, taught Gujarati for many years at UCL. So that there was a presence of Indians of this elite class that you're talking about. In addition to diplomats, there were some tourists, and then these are professionals, that is people who came either to become professionals as students or who have themselves professionals as language teachers when they arrived. I hope that addresses some of the points.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor Fisher. We're going to Mr. Yahya Burt. Please ask your question. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you to the Islamic College for hosting this wonderful event. Professor Fisher, I guess I was fascinated to hear about the description of a Muharram procession in East London in the early 1900s, and that's something I was aware of. Is there anything else you can tell us about organized Muslim religious life in London in the first half of the 19th century, or anything like informal mosques and so on? And secondly, in terms of future research, where would you direct people who want to work on sources written about or by these early Muslim sojourners, settlers, travelers? Are there texts that need to be translated and from Urdu or Farsi and brought into English? I'd be very interested in having any leads that I can work on with colleagues, because we've been working on Ottoman travelogues, but it would be good to look at any Urdu or Farsi travelogues to London or England in the 19th century or earlier as well.
Yes, well, I certainly commend you for your work. This is very important. What comes to mind are in terms of, if you will, physical public expressions of Islamic religion or culture are really two things. There are several mosques that are built, often patronized by some of these delegates, some of these delegations, some of the ambassadors, and these are scattered around London, both formal public mosques in squares or in other places, and then sometimes worship was done within homes. So if you look at some of the accounts, and I guess I would refer you to the bibliography in the Counterflows book for some of these, there would be clearly weekly prayers and special occasion prayers, religious rituals done in houses that had been rented by some of these delegations. So for example, when the Nawab Surat comes with a delegation of 30, 40 Muslims, in his basement, Muslims would gather on an evening basis to talk to each other, to give insights about what was working or not. Certainly there were some religious functions that were done. So they were both inside events that are very difficult to come across unless you happen to occasion this. And there were also a few mosques, and the mosques, I think the public ones are a little bit better, but there have been mosques that were established over time. There are also expressions which are maybe less religious in that sense and more maybe cultural expressions. And that is where I would look at the shampooing parlors, the hammams. And you find in London places where people would go. Originally, it was either the Indian medicated vapor bath started by Dean Muhammad, who was from India, or by British people who came back from South Asia with this chumpy or the massage. And they often used medicated vapor baths. And from the middle of the 19th century on, the Indian associations of these hammams or these shampooing parlors shifted over, and it became, of course, the Turkish bath, which is perhaps of more interest to you. But the Turkish bath house in London, and lesser extent in some other British cities, was a different kind of access to, if you will, Muslim or South Asian culture. And finally, of course, we might think about restaurants. The first Indian restaurant run by an Indian was also started by this same Dean Muhammad, who I've written some things about. And he started a restaurant, the so-called hookah parlor in the Regent Square. And so this is, again, where you can look at restaurants. Now, many of the restaurants became run by British people, and the difference between what the restaurant advertises itself as and who is actually doing the cooking, we know is a great gap. If you look at the number of restaurants in London in which, for example, there's a Bangladeshi cook, but they advertise themselves some other kind of cuisine, is very high. As far as the sources, much of the sources that I've been looking at are in the East India Company records, which are available. Clearly, there's not as much about Ottoman sources in there, but you do find evidence about how the Ottoman Empire was regarded. A number of Indians coming via Egypt particularly had to make choices about what they were going to wear in London. And it became very popular to wear Ottoman style clothing from the middle of the middle of the 19th century onward, Ottoman style clothing, because that was seen as both Muslim and also modern. And so that many of these people from India disguised their identities because the British really couldn't understand who they were, but they knew what the Ottoman Empire was all about. And in their minds, it was, if you will, a modernizing kind of Muslim empire. So Indians would sometimes tie into that by buying and wearing Ottoman clothing. And so in that sense, you can find some evidence. But as far as the Ottoman sources, the British Library, of course, you're very fortunate to have access to such a rich collection. And there are a growing number of really good translations from Persian and Urdu of texts written by Indians. Almost all of them have been translated to one degree or another, and there are more translations coming out. And again, I think that Professor Paya can suggest some of these sources that would be at least touching on the Ottoman Empire, in part because they would go through the empire to get to Britain. And I hope that answers some of the aspects of your important question.
Thank you very much, Professor Fisher, for answering these questions. As a segue to the next question by Rahmat Hidayat, I would like to turn the attention of all the attendees to the links that I have shared with all the audience members of this online session, including the last one, which talks about distance education from the Islamic College. Mr. Rahmat Hidayat is one of our students in the distance education. I would urge you to go to that link and see for yourself the strength of this program, which is offered by the Islamic College. Mr. Hidayat, go ahead.
Yes. Professor Fisher, just wondering, the early settlers, when they died, where were they buried? Which cemetery?
That's a very good question. It's a little bit difficult, in fact, sometimes to identify where people were, where they were buried. You do have sources such as the Ancestry.com and Search Your Ancestors and so on. And what a number of these places have done is take British parish records and digitize it, and you can do searches by name. So I've done quite a lot of that, just using fairly typical Indian names and trying to see where they were buried, and then you can go to the actual burial records of these parish churches. In order to be buried, you really had to be in a parish church at this time in Britain. And so what you find is a number of the Muslims who stayed on, particularly those who married British women, English women, and at least nominally converted. Because in order to be buried, you had to be a member of the parish. In order to marry, you had to be a member of the parish. So you have people who clearly have Muslim names who are marrying English women, British women, having children by them, who often have mixed Indian and English names. And you can begin through these searches of the parish records to come up with some of the names. There's also some discussion in some parishes, and this was often in the East India Company records, about whether a churchyard would allow a cemetery to have Indians do ceremonies there. You know, taking in a body is one thing, but having a formal ceremony and a 40-day ceremony was something that the English parishioners didn't like particularly. There's also the issue that many of the Catholic churches, where people, for example, from the Philippines might be buried, are not willing to cooperate or hadn't been willing to cooperate with the Christians, Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. And so they don't appear as much in the records from Catholic parishes. So those died in Ireland, for example, didn't have as much information, or in Catholic areas in England. So that it's a little bit hard to get access. If you go for some of the more prominent people, they're in more distinguished cemeteries that are places. Kensal Green, for example, has some. And famous people, Ram Mohan Roy, for example, was buried in Bristol. He's not a Muslim, but there's a monument to him. So it's taking a lot of pieces of evidence and trying to put them together. And occasionally you do find some discussion about this. So I might suggest you sort of look at in the published books about Muslims and other Asians in Britain, and you can try to look through the bibliography as to where they found those records. So I can't give you an easy answer, but I can suggest some of the places you might look.
Yes, yes, thank you very much.
The next question is from the chat section. I believe it's Lali Fatima. Lali Fatima, would you like to ask the question yourself, or should I read it? Well, I'll go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead and ask the question.
You can read it.
Okay, I'll read it. She says, thank you for this interesting talk. Was interested to know where the fake painting of Tipu Sultan you showed is at present. I've seen the dress of Tipu Sultan, which he wore when he was captured and killed at display at Windsor Castle, a rather sad reminder of India's colonization by the British. So,
yes, most of the pictures that you see are in major British collections. I'll have to look to see that one particular one where I found it. If you look under Wilkie, let's see if I have yes, I'm afraid I didn't. Some of these sketches I have, but not. I don't have the source for it. So what I suggest is, if you look these days, you can easily just Google Wilkie and Baird, B-A-I-R-D.
yeah, reverse Google image search.
Sorry?
You can do reverse Google image search.
Yes, that would do it as well. And I think that there are various sketches that I put together with some of the reproductions, the colored reproductions. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to just direct you to do the search on your own. But yes, the Windsor Castle